Earlier today, SoFi broke above $17 a share. Now, that's the highest the stock's been over the past several years. And in spite of this, yesterday we got a Form 144, which seemed on surface to highlight that Anthony Noto, the CEO, was selling 2 million shares valued at $33.76 million, except for the fact that it wasn't a stock sale. And it might just end up being one of the most genius ways that a CEO is betting on their stock going up. And so in this video, I wanted to break it down, including all the math and all the filings in very simple to understand terminology. Let's jump right into it. So I want to highlight off the bat that this is not a typical stock sale, despite what the thumbnail or the title of this video may end up being. And the reason I'm doing a video just for this news alone is because it's a little bit more complicated than just him selling shares in the open market. And I think it might be one of the best, most bullish moves that a CEO can do on their stock. In fact, the Form 4 came with several disclosures and also an additional 8K that highlighted a detailed explanation on this news. So we're going to break it all down. Now, yesterday there was some confusion around the stock. So because we didn't have all of these details, we got a Form 144, which basically precedes a Form 4. It's a notice of proposed sale. And this highlighted that Anthony Noto is selling 2 million shares, which has a market value of $33.7 million, and that the broker was Goldman Sachs. Now, that's not a lot of information to go off of, so I can see how that alone could cause panic among investors, because Anthony Noto has been the person buying shares consistently for the past 3 years of SoFi, buying heavily into the $4 and $5 ranges, buying at the very bottom multiple times, and being one of the largest proponents of SoFi. So, of course, you don't want to see him sell. He's actually never sold SoFi stock. So this was the first transaction of this nature that we see in this document. And in fact, this is the first ever filing from Anthony Noto that isn't just a straight up purchase of more shares. So moving now to the Form 4, it highlights the same 2 million shares, but it also states that this is a prepaid forward contract with a maturity of February 7th, 2028. And there's a few paragraphs on the bottom of the form that we're going to read and break down. But immediately you can tell that this is not a conventional stock sale, but rather that Anthony Noto is pledging 2 million shares of SoFi stock in exchange for an upfront cash payment of $22.4 million. So let's now dive into the explanation directly. On December 16th, yesterday, the reporting person, Anthony Noto, entered into a prepaid variable forward contract with an unaffiliated third-party dealer, Goldman Sachs, most likely. They were the broker on the Form 144. The contract obligates Anthony Noto to pay back in stock or in cash on the settlement date, February 7th, 2028, which is the maturity date. In exchange, Anthony Noto will receive upfront cash of $22.4 million. So in everyday language, this is basically saying that Goldman Sachs is giving Anthony Noto $22.4 million, and they want a repayment in February of 2028, and Anthony Noto can repay in cash or in stock. It's a loan, right? Now, the first thing I noticed was that this amount that he's getting upfront in cash is lower than the open market value of the shares today, because in the Form 144, the open market value was $33.7 million, and Anthony Noto is only borrowing $22 million. Now, the explanation goes on to say that this pledged $2 million doesn't revoke any of his rights. He's still going to have all his voting rights and every other rights that he has as a shareholder. He's just pledging the shares as collateral. So it's similar to me having like a covered call on a stock. I still can get a dividend from that stock. I still have voting rights in that stock. I'm essentially just making a commitment to get those shares called away at a certain date. But until that date, I still have all my rights as a shareholder. The stock is still mine to have. I can also choose to buy back that covered call and nothing really happens. It's different because it's a loan, but the same kind of concept applies where he still owns all the rights to his shares. Now, the rest of the explanation is kind of convoluted, so I'll break it down in everyday language. This is the stipulations of the deal. So we already talked about the maturity date, which is February 7, 2028, where he can pay back in cash or he can pay back in shares. And as for the loan piece itself, I understand that with the market being where it is, many executives are choosing to cash out or at the very least raise more money for other ventures. We can see this with Jeff Bezos straight up selling Amazon stock, or in the case of Anthony Noto, he has restricted stock units that vest at certain periods. So in the summer of 2026, if the stock price of SoFi is trading $25, $35, or $45, Anthony Noto has a compensation package where he is granted more shares, similar to how Elon had his compensation package. And in a similar case, I also remember with Elon when this happened at a point where he sold shares for tax reasons and also literally to buy back more shares of Tesla stock because he had more shares that had been given to him, essentially. So there's many such maneuvers available to executives, and taking out your shares as collateral for a loan is one of the best ways to do it. And not only because you get paid more shares, but it's also strategic to do it because you get upfront liquidity, you get cash today without selling your shares. And by doing that, you also avoid immediate tax liabilities. If he had sold the shares on the open market today, it would, number one, tank the stock. Number two, he would have to pay taxes on the $22 million that he would get as proceeds, right? And number three, he wouldn't have the upside potential on the stock going higher from here. And in this case, he's betting that the stock price is going to go higher. So let's talk now about how those shares are calculated, because this is where it becomes kind of interesting. Now, the easiest possible outcome in 2028 is that he just pays back in cash and nothing happens to the shares. It's just a loan he took out and he's paying back. And just on that very simplistic basis, it would have been beneficial for him because he can get an interest rate much lower than an interest rate that you and I could possibly get if we took out a loan today. So that's the simplest explanation, but I think it's actually much more interesting than that. In fact, there was an 8K that was released today, which actually broke out the exact amount of shares that he would pay if the stock price was trading for $30.74 or above. The 8K highlights that if the stock price is above the cap price on maturity date, so if the price is above $30.74 by February of 2028, then he would have to deliver under 850,000 shares, which is actually less than half of this 2 million shares that he's holding on collateral today. So not only is it not a stock sale and something super ordinary that every executive does, but immediately after reading this news and after reading the stipulations, I thought of Michael Saylor and what he's been doing with the price of Bitcoin now hitting all-time highs, is issuing unsecured convertible debt and then using the proceeds of that debt to go ahead and buy more Bitcoin, which is essentially betting on Bitcoin to go up higher. Now, obviously, this is not the same, but the thought came into my mind wondering what Anthony Noto would use that money for. With an amount like 22 million, it could very easily be, him buying another house or him, having an extravagant purchase. And that's absolutely a possibility. And in fact, it's probably a likelihood. But I could only imagine how bullish it would be for him to essentially buy more shares in the open market. Because if the stock price does go up over these next 3 years until February 2028, the gains on the additional shares that he could buy and the structure of the deal being what it is means that Anthony Noto could be making even more money on SoFi stock with borrowed money from other financial institutions. And let me be clear, that's very risky and that's very unlikely to happen. But if it were to happen, it would be incredibly bullish because he would essentially be betting on SoFi stock to go higher, using money from the same financial institutions that have been short this company for the past 2 years. I even broke down some of the numbers in a post I made earlier today. And I want to run through some of those numbers just for the sake of being exhaustive in this video, but also because I think it's a fascinating outcome, which I'd love to see over the next week or so. So in my post, I highlighted that Noto put up 2 million shares of collateral to borrow $22.4 million. And in this video, I use an analogy of like a covered call because he still owns the shares. He just has an obligation against those shares at a certain price. In this case, the price, which was highlighted in the 8K, is $30.74 by February 7th, 2028, which is the maturity date. If SoFi is above that threshold by that date, Anthony Noto would deliver the fewest amount of shares, 849,000 shares. And the reason is because the stock price has appreciated and those shares are now worth more, whereas the money he borrowed, the 22 million, is a fixed number. It's an absolute number. Now, here's where it becomes interesting because Anthony Noto could use that $22 million today to buy an additional 1.3 million shares that where SoFi is trading at $16.5 per share. Now, that's not only the most bullish scenario, but it's also the most risky scenario because if the stock price is lower in 2028 than what it is today, he would end up losing money on this deal. But assuming he does use the full amount today, it buys him an additional 1.3 million shares, which is 511,000 shares more than the obligation he needs to meet at the highest tranche. So assuming for a second that SoFi is above $30.74 by February of 2028, he would have to pay back about 850,000 shares. If he bought 1.3 million today, the difference is 511,000 shares, which are his to own. Of course, there could be any type of variation here to make the numbers make more sense. And obviously to limit more of that downside risk, I mean, he could even use half of the money, $10 million to buy shares, thereby limiting his exposure somewhat, but also limiting his gains if the stock price is trading above $30. There could also be another scenario where the stock price trades under $30, but also higher from here, which would also factor into these numbers. So this is just an example to get your mind around this deal. So let's just stick with this example and assume he uses the full amount of money to buy more shares at $16.50. He's left over with 511,000 shares, more than the 849,000 shares that he would have to give up by February of 2028. So if SoFi reaches this cap price, which is $30.74 by February of 2028, that's an 86% increase from here, meaning that the profit on the shares that he would buy today is a total of 19.3 million shares, because he bought 13, because he would take the $22 million from Goldman Sachs to buy 1.3 million shares at $16.50. That would be $19 million in profit at $30.74. Now, at $30.74, he would have to give up 849,000 of those 1.3 million shares, and he would be left over with 511,000 shares that are his own, which still has a gain of $7.2 million purely on borrowed money. And not only is it on borrowed money, but it's on money borrowed from other financial institutions, many of whom are bearish on SoFi stock. And that, to me, is not only poetic, but it's one of the most bullish things that an executive could ever do for their stock, is essentially not only them doubling down on SoFi stock with their own money, but then borrowing other people's money to triple down on their stock even more. Now, of course, we're going to see how that plays out. We could easily see a Form 4 come out from Anthony Noto, which highlights an additional stock purchase this week. And that would very much be getting me excited about my SoFi position. I'd probably end up letting my covered calls get exercised at $15 and actually increasing my SoFi position even further than what it is today and building that up higher, because I want my incentives to be strongly aligned with management incentives, because management is essentially betting on themselves, but they also have the most amount of information about the company. Now, I'll do a full breakdown of all the SoFi news on Friday or Saturday of this week, which also includes other interesting announcements we got this week, including earlier today, SoFi posting on X that they'd crossed the 10 million member threshold, and other executives are also purchasing shares in the teens. I'm going to be covering all of this at the end of this week, but I couldn't help jumping on this video to clarify this specific piece of news, because I know that there was a lot of people confused, and many people might still be confused as to what is going on. But this is actually one of the most bullish things that an executive could do if he ends up buying back SoFi stock with those proceeds. That's unlikely to happen. He's likely just using that money to buy like another house or something, which is fine. It's just a loan that he has to repay by that date. He still owns his shares. But if he uses that money to buy more SoFi stock, that's very bullish. It's going to be very, very bullish. And I'm going to be owning more SoFi shares as a result. We'll see if it happens. What you have to be looking out for is another Form 4 probably in the next couple of days or in the next week or so. And that would solidify the most bullish scenario. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, share it out with someone who you think would also enjoy it. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.